I'd like to spend some time just helping people who aren't as experienced with Angular, maybe don't have a lot of experience with web dev, and would like to learn more. Maybe you want to just see what Angular is about. Maybe you want to get into web dev and work in a corporate environment where Angular is quite popular. There could be a lot of reasons that you might want to look into Angular. So today we'll talk about that a bit. The first thing I'd like to talk about is a tool that actually helps make Angular a bit better. And it's not necessarily even Angular. I develop on Windows, and one of the tools that I use quite a bit is Volta. And let's just run a Volta list right now. So right now, with Volta, I am currently on node 1419, and I have Angular CLI installed and the NX CLI installed by default. The reason that I like Volta is that it works better than the NVM Windows that I was using before. And there are some other things that we'll see as we work through. But out of the box, I highly recommend that you find something like NVM, Volta. Tim DeShriver just posted in Twitter today about how he sets up his Windows environment. And one thing he mentioned, he's using a tool called FNM. And FNM stands for Fast Node Manager. I personally haven't used this one before, but it comes highly recommended. So you might want to check that one out too. This is the tool I'll be using today. I like Volta because I know it pretty well, and it does what I need it to do. It manages my node packages, and that's the big part, is making sure that we're managing our node packages. And there are two package managers that come along with there's one package manager that comes along with Node by default, npm. And by default, it installs the version 6.14.17. Today, I'd like to use Yarn a bit. So let's install Yarn to use with Volta. And now, if we look in Volta, Yarn is now available for us. We can now do a Yarn version. See that we've got Yarn installed. So today, rather than using npm, let's use Yarn. It's a faster package manager. Today, we're going to be doing kind of a learning stream. Another tool that we're going to be using today is NX. Out of the gate, the reason that I'm talking about Volta and Yarn and things like that is Lars has this amazing, it's a list of every version of Angular from 2.02, along with the CLI version that works with it, along with the Node.js version that you should use with it, the TypeScript version, and the RxJS version that's going to work. So we are going to be using NX to create our environment, which means we'll be on 13.3 today, and then we'll be doing an upgrade to 14.0. And we'll be looking down the road into some of the benefits that 14 brings to us. But today we're going to be doing 13. 13.3 works with Node version 16. So we're going to use Volta to set up Node version 16. So the first thing we need to do is we're just going to install Node at 16.10. Volta is going to go out and it's going to grab that for us. So if I want to go back to 14, I just install Node at 14. And since I already had it downloaded, it set me back at Node with 14. So let's do a Volta install Node at 16.10. And that's the version we're going to use for today. It automatically picks npm version 7.24. And we are going to set up an NX workspace using Yarn. So to do that, we've already installed Yarn. We're going to do a Yarn. We're going to do a create NX-workspace. workspace. And it's downloading all the packages for us. The workspace is, I guess I do need to slow down just a bit and tell you what we're going to be building today. Before we name our workspace, we need to talk just a little bit about kind of what the goals are. I want to create the prototypical to-do app, right? And then as we go along, what we're going to do is enhance that with new features that NX and Angular will give to us. We'll explore testing, we'll explore Cypress, we'll explore Storybook, we'll explore all these other really amazing tools. And that's part of the reason why I chose to go with NX right off the bat. I actually find NX to be indispensable when I'm working with Angular anymore. Angular and the Angular CLI are amazing, and they do amazing things, but NX takes the CLI and makes it that much better. And it adds tools that just make Angular better out of the box. For example, you can get ESLint right out of the box. You can get Cypress testing. You can do just unit testing. And so we'll discuss that as we fill this out. But the workspace name, we're just going to call it Learn Angular. We're definitely going to create an Angular workspace. The application name is also going to be Learn Angular. By default, we're going to use Sass. I have thought about using Angular Material. Since we're open source, we're going to do the NX Cloud. If you're going to be using NX in your company workspace, definitely make sure that you're using, that you discuss with your team using the NX Cloud. And that's interesting. That's really interesting that it used npm install when I used yarn to run the create NX workspace. I'm curious why it did that. Let's stop this. Yes, we're going to terminate that. We're going to. Did it create? Yes, it did. We're just going to delete this. So we're just gonna clean out the Learn Angular directory. All right. So it looks like if I do the create workspace, I can specify the package manager. And we're gonna call it Learn Angular again. It's going to be an Angular workspace. We're going to call it Learn Angular. SCSS, yes to the cloud. And now we're just installing the dependencies with Yarn. The reason that I wanted to use Yarn today, one, it's good to just familiarize yourself with different tools. One of the big reasons I wanted to use Yarn is you saw how long it took with npm to install the dependencies. We're already done with our dependencies on Yarn, and now it's just setting up the NX workspace. And once that workspace is set up, we'll go take a look at it and just explore some things about it. We are going to use Volta to pin our Node version and our Yarn version so that whenever we come into this project with any of our shells, we'll be using the same version of Yarn all the time, and Node. NX has done its thing, so now let's go into our Learn Angular. And so I'm using Oh My Posh as a way to do my shell, and you'll notice that it creates a Git repository for us, and we've already got some commits that we need to push. I like GitKraken because I do like the GUI, but one of the things I really like about GitKraken is that you can drop into a command line at any point. But from here, I can do a git status. So I don't have anything staged. So we've got our initial commit, and the nx.json, the commits here, adding the NX cloud and all of that. We're going to stage that, and we are going to push this. We're going to use GitHub. We're going to push it to my account. Learn Angular is going to be the repository name. And this is the Angular project used for Sunday streams. I'm going to have public access on this. And so now we're good. I'm going to close the terminal for now. But now we've got everything pushed up there. We're going to commit these NX changes, and we're going to push this to the repository. And at this point, we're going to create a branch for today. We're just going to call this stream. We'll just put today's date on it. Today is June 5th. At this point, we've committed everything. So now let's pop this open in VS Code, and we'll explore the project and just kind of go over what comes with it. We've just popped into VS Code for the first time, and we're kind of looking around. NX structures our project a little bit differently than a typical Angular CLI project. If you create one using ng, like ng create, what you'll notice is that right off the bat, we get VS Code and some recommended extensions. So the nice thing about this is that if you're missing any of these extensions, they'll show up at the bottom as, extensions that you should use. And there's some really good ones. ng template adds templates to HTML as you're typing to help you, create Angular HTML. The Narwhal Angular console is amazing. We're going to be using that extensively to create our libraries, to create our components, to create everything. Prettier VS Code. I highly recommend this if you're by yourself or if you're working with anybody else. VS Code, the Prettier VS Code extension, will keep your code formatted in a consistent manner, and it just kind of helps with a team. When you start working with teams of developers, you find out pretty quickly that everybody has opinions, and that's amazing. That helps your development team just grow and be better. The problem with opinions is that sometimes the opinions aren't that important. Like, I've worked on teams where we've argued tabs versus spaces, or 2 versus 3 versus 4 spaces, or things like that. Prettier takes that all away from us. We can set it up however we want, and then everybody does the same thing. The jest runner is nice. You can run jest codes jest tests from inside of VS Code. And finally, the ESLint plugin, we'll see that as we're working through. It's going to give us feedback on our code. So it gives us some extension ideas right off the bat. The next thing you'll notice is that we have a Learn Angular application, which is where our source code is going to go. And then we've got a Learn Angular E2E. Learn Angular E2E is a Cypress project that NX has set up for us right off the bat. And we will be using Cypress to test our application as we build it. This will be a learning experience for me also. I don't do a lot of Cypress testing, and I really need to learn it. And so I'll be spending some time learning that. It adds a Libs library. Libs will be where we add all of our libraries. You think of libraries as places to store code. So you may have components that you want to share, or you may have services that you want to share, things like that. You can put that code into a library and keep it together and share it. Finally, it adds some generators, tools. This is a little bit more advanced. Maybe we'll get into it down the road. But you can do some amazing things with NX. It adds an editor.config file, or a .editor config file. And it will set up a bunch of stuff for you. Prettier will listen to this. One thing I do like to do is set, and I always have to Google this. So it's max line length. And the reason I like to set the max line length is that typically it's set around, 80. And we have all of this space in our editor. I usually set it to 140. That will inform Prettier that when it is wrapping lines and things, that our lines can get up to 140. I have a rulers extension. This yellow line is at 80 characters. This red line out here is at 140. It's going to add an ESLint RC. This will tell our lint tools as we're working on our code, what rules should we be following? And we will go into a little bit of this because there are some great ESLint packages out there that I add to quite a few of my projects, especially around RxJS. There's some great RxJS rules that we'll make sure to go into just to teach how to set up an environment and, explore some rules. Git Ignore is important. Making sure that you have your Git Ignore set up properly is a big help so that you're not having to go through and ignore a bunch of files as you're trying to check things in. Prettier Ignore will tell it that if we're in these directories, Prettier isn't going to do anything. Prettier RC is where you can customize Prettier to your team's liking. Angular JSON is used by NX to tell it where the packages are, what packages are in your projects. There are other things that we'll explore in the Angular.json as we move forward. The decorate Angular CLI is an important file. And what that does is if I use ng right now, say I do ng add, it is decorated by NX because NX is an extension to the Angular CLI. And there might be some things that NX does that, or that the ng CLI does that NX doesn't understand. And so this decorator, so if we do ng test, the decorator goes in, it intercepts that command, and it tells it, hey, run this instead. The decorator is a good way, if you're used to typing ng all the time, that decorator will go in and intercept things and tell you the command that it's going to run, and kind of help you learn the NX CLI. Our project was set up with Jest, so we'll be using Jest to test our project. nx.json is another important file. Inside of here, you have all of your dependencies. It tells us that we're using Yarn as our package manager. It specifies all sorts of stuff about NX. And we'll explore this a little bit further down the road. Package.json is an important file. You use this all the time, whether you're using npm, pnpm, yarn, whatever your package manager is. Inside of here, there are some scripts that you can run. These scripts will serve our project, they'll build our project. Down the road, as we get into deployments and things like that, we'll be adding scripts here that can be run from our CI/CD build pipeline or things like that to make our lives easier. The dependencies tell us what packages does this project depend on. You can see we're at Angular 13.3. We're using RxJS 7.4, TSLib greater than version 2, and we're using Zone.js. And then there's a bunch of dev dependencies. Dev dependencies aren't deployed with your project. These dependencies are used specifically by the developer. As we add more things, material will show up in here, things like that. There's a Readme that was created by NX, and you can see the Readme starts off discussing NX. as these projects grow, I recommend making your README. For example, at my current work, we use the README to store everything about the project. So if somebody needs to learn how to set up their environment, they can go to the README, follow the README step by step, and their environment will be set up to work. I highly recommend using the README. We'll look into customizing that a little bit more in the future. tsconfig.base is important. This is used by every project that NX creates. This is the base that everything follows off of. When you create a new project, you'll notice up here in the apps, learn Angular, we've got a tsconfig.app, we've got a tsconfig.editor, we've got a tsconfig.json, and a tsconfig.spec. These files are used by your source code editor to know how to display and what rules to follow and things like that. You'll notice that in your tsconfig, this points back to the base that we were just looking at. It adds a couple of other rules here that are best practices. So we're forcing consistent casing and file names. We're using strict Angular, which is good. We're using no implicit overrides. We're using no property access from index signature. But let's slow down. Let's talk about consistent casing and file names. And we can explain this right here. So, a lot of times you'll wind up with, my file name.component.ts, and then somebody else comes along and they will create my file name.component.ts, and you wind up with all these weird file naming conventions. And so when you go to look for a file, you don't remember, does it have the dashes in it? Does it not have the dashes in it? What do we do? By using the consistent casing and file names, then if your file name doesn't match, it's Angular's going to complain about it. Angular strict turns on a couple more rules that make Angular more strict, but it turns on strict template compiling. It turns on strict null checks. It turns on parameter checking. There's a whole bunch of stuff in strict that is very useful. It will make your code cleaner, and you should definitely be using it. If you add strict to existing projects, you may have quite a bit to clean up. You don't realize how much strict watches out for until you turn it on. No implicit override. I actually need to look up myself. So it's saying when working with classes which use inheritance, it's possible for a subclass to get out of sync with the functions it overloads when they are renamed in the base class. For example, imagine you were modeling a music. So it's saying that we've got an album. We've got a shared album that extends album. Then when you add support for machine learning generated playlist, you refactor the album class to have setup function instead. Oh, okay. I see what happens here. What it's saying is that by default in TypeScript, you can use implicit overrides. So if we look at this class album as the base class that both of these classes extend, by using, in the original case, it was named download and shared album extended download. But we're using an implicit override because we aren't specifically saying that you're overriding this class. Notice here that they've renamed overload to setup. They've got a new album that extends it, and it extends setup. But they forgot about shared album, so now shared album has a download method that is really doing nothing, and now we're out of sync. When you turn on the no implicit override, you're now forced to use the override keyword when you override a method from the base class. And what that does is if you've got something set up as an override and it's been renamed in the base class, you'll get an error. It will also stop you from not doing an implicit override. I wasn't aware of that one. No proprietary access for from index signature. That's another TS config option, I'm sure. In TypeScript and JavaScript, there are two ways to access an object with a dot or an index. With this TypeScript flag, TypeScript will allow you to use a dot syntax to access fields which are not defined. Oh, that's really cool. So in the past, if you had an object that could have dynamic properties on it, to be able to access them, you would have to use the indexer syntax, which is this syntax. With this turned on, it looks like we can just use the dot syntax. So we'll have to play with that one a little bit too. No implicit returns. Sometimes we can write a function, right? And we can say that this returns a Boolean. And here we can just say if, and we'll pass in some prop. And if some prop is true, we're going to return false, right? For whatever reason. So we'll go into app component here. Because the type is undefined, is Boolean and not undefined, by default, if you don't have a final return statement, your function is going to return undefined. There are a lot of cases in code that I've encountered where you forget a code path and that code path doesn't return something and you get an undefined. So Baron von Perko asks, are you using a plugin to make your cursor look like that? Or is it part of the theme you're using? Which cursor are you talking about? This one? Oh, that's blinking like that? You can configure that in VS Code. So if you go into your user settings, and inside of here, you look for cursor. So I've got my cursor set up to do that expand, which does that blinking like that. I've got it set up to be a line, and you can do all sorts of amazing stuff with the cursor right inside of VS Code. I like to get in and play around with the settings. I like to read the updates as they come out, things like that. The no fall through and switch cases in a switch case. And we'll just do const. We'll do something, we'll call it test string, right? We'll take in a string to test, and it will return a Boolean. So now we're going to do a switch on string to test. Right, and say it is admin. We're going to return true. Case user. We're going to fall through here, right? We're going to say case user, and we're going to do case guest. We're going to return false, and our default is to return false. From 15 to 16, we're falling through our switch case statement. And if I understand this one properly, then by enabling no fall through, it should be catching this as an error. It's not for some reason. I would expect it to catch that. So the strict injection parameters in Angular requires us to be strict about how we inject things into our Angular constructors. We'll talk about that when we get into dependency injection and constructors. The strict access modifiers, again, is requiring us to be strict about our private, public, things like that. And strict templates is amazing because it will type check our templates and make sure that we aren't using undefined or null in cases where we don't expect undefined or null. So that is the tsconfig that it adds into the project. The tsconfig base adds a couple of other things in here, telling us, we want to generate source maps. We want to use Node as our module representatives. We want to use the emit decorator metadata because Angular uses decorators quite a bunch, quite extensively was the word I was searching for. And experimental decorators has to be turned on to use the decorators that Angular uses. And we're targeting ES 2015. And it sets up our libs, sets up just a bunch of stuff in here that makes things nice. One thing to note, in your tsconfig base is where you will set up the paths for your libraries. So in the future, when we generate libraries, we're going to be using nice names for our libraries. And this paths variable is where you can set that up. And we'll explore that more in depth as we get to that point. And then yarn lock is like the npm lock. And if we look at our package.json, you'll notice that, our Angular animations are set to be around 13.3. And our tslib is set to be greater than 2.0, right? And so without a lock file, then if somebody else comes along, does a yarn install after us, then they could get different versions, and so their environment could behave differently. This is especially important when you're using CI/CD, because your yarn lock file will make sure that your continuous integration environment is locked to what was checked in, which is incredibly important so that you get the same build as you push it out. But those are the 5